Welcome back, everyone, to the Damage Report. I'm John Arola. Big show today. We're going to be doing a dive back into Syria and Turkey and the Kurds. Some really worrying moves being made by the US military as they desperately flee ahead of the Turkish-backed militia groups that are now taking over formerly US-held territory. Also, Trump's letter to Erdogan. It's real, and we're going to dive into it. We're also going to be closing out the show with Meanwhile In, touching on the banning of climate protests in London and how they're fighting back. We're going to talk about the protests in Hong Kong and some of the horrific violence against protest leaders recently, as well as a little bit of positive news involving how environmental regulations have helped one population of animals bounce back. Along the way, we're going to have guests who are going to be joining us to talk about pro-democracy reforms and also ranked choice voting. So we're going to be diving into those topics as well. But before we can get to all of that, we're going to be starting off with an incredibly sad story. So prepare yourself, this is going to be tough. At 68, Elijah Cummings passed away today. That was the announcement that many people greeted the morning with. Very sad news, obviously when any politician dies, but particularly Elijah Cummings. There are few people serving in elected office right now that have rightfully accrued the sort of reputation and respect that he has, not just from people of his party, but across party lines. And all this morning, I've been going back through his personal history and looking at the different eulogizing quotes that a number of different people who knew and worked with him have put out. We're gonna have some of his more powerful moments from speeches. And it's the sort of thing that for me is just very difficult to accept. It's the death of someone who certainly I didn't agree with on every single policy, and I don't care because the personal qualities that this person had, the inability of almost anyone to claim that what he stood for was not what he truly believed, that just really gets me. It really strikes at me. And so let's talk about some of these quotes. I'm gonna give my impressions more towards the end, but there was a comment from his now widow after his death, which apparently took place at a hospice center. He apparently passed of health issues that he had held for some time. It had been about a month since he was seen on Capitol Hill. But his widow, Maya Rockymore Cummings, put out this statement saying, he worked until his last breath because he believed our democracy was the highest and best expression of our collective humanity and that our nation's diversity was our promise, not our problem. His commitment to protecting voting rights and civil rights and fighting his entire life for that, fighting for far longer than I've even been alive, was something that was echoed in a lot of the comments put out by people who knew him. Stacey Abrams, who shares with him a passionate fight to protect democracy. She said, our nation has lost a mighty fighter for democracy, accountability, equity, and justice with the tragic loss of Congressman Elijah Cummings. He never forgot that his was borrowed power, which he wielded in defense of the vulnerable and on behalf of the American people. AOC, who served on a committee with him for less than a year, but enough to see him as a sort of mentor figure, says a devastating loss for our country. Chairman Cummings was a giant, a universally respected leader who brought profound insight, commitment, and moral fortitude to Congress. His guidance and vision was an enormous gift. I will forever cherish his example. May he rest in power. It's really tough because, like, how many politicians have we seen through the course of our life that are either just weak and spineless or obviously in it for the interests of their donors? They're there to pursue an agenda that neither truly in their heart or in their brain do they follow themselves. They don't care about their constituents. Like, that is the go-to, that is the default with which we have learned to judge virtually every politician. And again, whether you agree with him on everything or not, he was obviously genuine. He was coming from a historically difficult fight. I read in his biography, at 11, he helped integrate a local swimming pool while being attacked with bottles and rocks. He was an 11-year-old and he was doing it already. And then he did it for another half century. That's just amazing. And when I look at like politicians like Devin Nunes and Ted Cruz and these people who, if they have a principle, they don't stand by it. And I doubt that they have them in the first place. It sucks to lose someone who had them and was constant in fighting for those. And one of the most important individual votes, and again, I'm not the sort of person that tries to, like throw a person aside or cancel them based on any individual vote, but one of the most important moral votes that a politician could have taken in the past couple of decades was the invasion of Iraq And Elijah Cummings was one in the minority who voted against it, that knew that even though anyone who talked against it, let alone voted against it, was going to be attacked nonstop as not being sufficiently patriotic or deferential to the American empire, but he did the right thing and voted against it. Again, it's not to discount every individual vote or anything like that, but we should take note when you lose someone who was strong and passionate and had values and stood by them. And so in that vein, I wanna play a couple of clips that I put together. The entire show could have been things like this, but I tried to limit myself to a couple of recent speeches that he gave. And so one is when he was speaking with the acting DHS chief about our network of concentration camps, and here's what he said.
You feel like you're doing a great job, right? Is that what you're saying?
We're doing our level best in a very
What does that mean? What does that mean when a child is sitting in their own feces, can't take a shower? Come on, man. What's that about? None of us would have our children in that position. They are human beings. And I'm trying to figure out, and I get tired of folks saying, oh, they just beating up on the Border Patrol. Oh, they just beating up on Homeland Security. Now, what I'm saying is I want to concentrate on these children. And I want to make sure that they are okay. I will say it, I've said it before, and I'll say it again. It's not the deed that you do to a child, it's the memory. And I told the head of Border Patrol the other day, I said, I want to know what's happening in the meantime. We are the United States of America. We are the greatest country in the world. We are the ones that can go anywhere in the world and save people. Make sure that they have diapers. Make sure that they have toothbrushes. Make sure that they're not laying around defecating in some silver paper. Come on, we're better than that.
It's just devastating. I mean, that was one of in the past 2 years, there's been so much damage done to, obviously our institutions, our norms, and so many immoral policies pursued, but that was one of the worst. And he was a reliable voice in speaking out against what he saw there. And like I said earlier, it wasn't just Democrats that are, like looking back and saying like this was a guy who said what he believed. Back during the Benghazi hearings, Darrell Issa, Trey Gowdy, these were two Republicans, hardcore Republicans, who they were focusing on this issue to the detriment of literally everything else. And Elijah Cummings fought against it. And they cut off his mic and he kept going, he wouldn't yield. And so you might think that like Trey Gowdy, who was obviously his opponent in this, would do what you see commonplace now and just attack him, try to destroy his reputation. But Trey Gowdy said, it's not about politics to him. He says what he believes, and you can tell the ones who are saying it because it was in a memo they got that morning, and you can tell the ones who it's coming from their soul. And with Mr. Cummings, it's coming from his soul. And on important issues, it always was. That's why he has this reputation beyond almost anyone else in government, because he was authentic, he was true, and we have so little of that. Nina Turner called him living history. I mean, I want to show you one other clip. I know that we're going over, but there was one more on voting rights, which was obviously, along with civil rights, it was the fight of his life, and so here he is.
1 year ago today, on my mother's dying bed at 92 years old, former sharecropper, her last words were, do not let them take our votes away from us. She had fought and seen people harmed, beaten, trying to vote. Talk about inalienable rights. Voting is crucial, and I don't give a damn how you look at it. There are efforts to stop people from voting. That's not right. This is not Russia. This is the United States of America. And I will fight until the death to make sure every citizen, whether they're Green Party, whether they're Freedom Party, whether they're Democrat, whether they're Republican, whoever has that right to vote. because it is the essence of our democracy.
I mean, again, I know that we're going over, I'm sorry, but like they're like I'm a progressive. There are other politicians who line up with me far more on the policy, who are more progressive, but he's decent, okay? And that is important. And there are some people who write that off and say, I don't care who you are, I don't care what your values are, get rid of the values. Here's a couple of issues, agree with me on this. If you ever do anything that makes me doubt you on that, you're done, okay? And so I have no doubt that on this day when all of the progressives, let alone everyone else that I look up to, are memorializing Elijah Cummings, there are gonna be some who are going to take this as a moment to pick him apart and to attack him because he wasn't sufficiently right on one issue or another. And there will be an audience for that, there always is. And so I just wanna say, if you do prefer that, if that's what you want in this moment, then I want you to do me a favor, don't watch this show, don't at me on Twitter. I'm not interested in that, honestly. There is far too little decency, and I don't mean fake bipartisanship. I don't mean, casting aside your ideological goals for, needlessly reaching across the aisle. I'm talking about actual human decency, truly caring about equity and about caring about people who have been cast aside by this government. And if you feel like when we lose one of the few people who truly has stood for those things for the course of their life, that what you need is for that person to be laid low, if that's what you need, I don't want your support. The movement does not need your support, okay? That's sort of petty stuff. And honestly, like the sort of example that people like Elijah Cummings set, I'm not simply sitting here saying I want other politicians to live up to that. I want other political pundits and analysts to live up to that. I want to live up to that. I'm not that good. I'm really not. I was talking before the show about some tweets I sent today that don't live up to this example, but I'm trying to be better and I wish more people would. I wish more people cared about that and looked for that. Whether it's on the side of elected politicians, on the side of activists and commentators, whatever position you hold in this ridiculous thing that we're doing, like you should be able to look at Elijah Cummings and learn something. We all can. Some will choose not to, but we should try to learn from this man. With that said, I'm gonna take a break. When we come back, guest's gonna join us. We're gonna talk about the fight for voting rights and the lack of focus on it in the Democratic debate after this.
We need to talk about a relatively new show called the Republic, or UNFTR. As a Young Turks fan, you already know that the government, the media, and corporations are constantly peddling lies that serve the interests of the rich and powerful. But now there's a podcast dedicated to unraveling those lies, debunking the conventional wisdom. In each episode of the Republic, or UNFTR, the host delves into a different historical episode or topic that's generally misunderstood or purposely obfuscated by the so-called powers that be, featuring in-depth research, razor-sharp commentary, and just the right amount of vulgarity. The UNFTR podcast takes a sledgehammer to what you thought you knew about some of the nation's most sacred historical cows. But don't just take my word for it. The New York Times described UNFTR as consistently compelling and educational, aiming to challenge conventional wisdom and upend the historical narratives that were taught in school. For as the great philosopher Yoda once put it, you must unlearn what you have learned. And that's true whether you're in Jedi training or you're uprooting and exposing all the propaganda and disinformation you've been fed over the course of your lifetime. So search for UNFTR in your podcast app today and get ready to get informed, angered, and entertained all at the same time.
At both the debate this week and at the debates we've had so far this cycle for the Democratic primary, there have been a number of topics that have not been discussed nearly as much as they merit. I pointed out on Twitter, climate change did not merit even a single question at this debate. But one topic that has been barely discussed through all of the debates so far is our democracy, voting rights, reforming it to make sure that people have their democracy not only in name, but also in fact. And so we've been doing this analysis over the course of this primary so far with Eichen. Adam joins us once again. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. This feels like deja vu.
It certainly does, and I want to give you credit. You're an author and campaigns manager for Equal Citizens. Really appreciate you joining us. So look, we scheduled this interview before the debate, so we could have been surprised. Were you surprised at the debate earlier this week?
Was I surprised? No. Was I hoping for something better? Yes. I mean, again, this marks the fourth debate just this cycle that there wasn't a single question about democracy reform. There was one question about the Supreme Court and what to do about that. Incredibly important, but nothing about the voter purges currently going on in Ohio, nothing about the gerrymandering that has locked Democrats out of power in that state and in states across the country, nothing about money in politics. I mean, this is insane. I mean, talk about something that has kept the Democrats out of power and been systematically benefiting the Republicans for the last decade. You would think that the people who are trying to become the leaders of this party would want to discuss this issue.
So I want your opinion on two sources of the silence. So why is it that CNN and the New York Times, who put together these questions, that they didn't include it? And why is it that the Democratic candidates aren't choosing to bring it up anyway? I mean, at least for climate change, for instance, there were no questions, but Bernie and I think it was Steyer, they both brought it up. So why the silence from those two different groups?
Well, I think that the debates thus far have just shown that they're not willing to engage in some serious issues. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about healthcare, but as you noticed, there was nothing on climate change, and there was nothing on democracy. So I think there's just something perhaps embedded in this corporate-controlled debate system that we have, that they're just not asking the questions that many Americans want to learn more about and where the candidates stand. In terms of the candidates, I mean, I will say that some candidates like Tom Steyer and Elizabeth Warren tried to bring up these issues of democracy reform. And in Elizabeth Warren's case, she pledged to fix democracy first. She said her first act would be passing the anti-corruption plan. And then she was actually interrupted when she was trying to get into a conversation about money in politics by Kamala Harris. Because Harris apparently thought that it was more important to discuss whether or not Trump should be banned from Twitter. That for me was a very upsetting moment in the debate, perhaps even more than at any other point, because we had finally maybe begun to have a conversation about why it was so critical to fix democracy and how to do it. Earlier that day, Elizabeth Warren had actually released her plan, a very good plan, which includes a 6-to-1 match, a public financing plan. It would have been a great opportunity for the senator to talk about public financing, but that conversation was derailed. And actually, most of the front-running candidates have strong democracy reform plans. Bernie recently released an excellent plan that would give every American a democracy vouchers like they have in Seattle right now. It's a public financing system. He didn't specify how much the vouchers would be worth, but essentially every eligible voter would receive money essentially to give to candidates, a really kind of a radical form of public financing that could completely revolutionize and democratize political influence. But that didn't come up at all either.
Yeah, and even though, again, like his plans in that area I mean, they're not from 6 months ago. It's not like they have to go way back to find the details. They've been in the news the past week or so. Like it seems like it would have been relatively easy to ask some follow-up. So you mentioned solutions there. So I have a couple different things I'd like to get into that in that area. But one is, when you list all of the different attacks against democracy that we're seeing, is it time for a new sort of Voting Rights Act, perhaps something that stretches across the entirety of the country and that protects against these sorts of constant recurring assaults against our democracy?
Absolutely. I mean, the Supreme Court gutted the 1965 Voting Rights Act in 2013. And ever since that moment, you see a proliferation of really awful anti-democratic policies that are suppressing the votes across the country. You see that in voter purges. You see that in the proliferation of voter ID laws. So absolutely, we have to restore the Voting Rights Act to make it so that states with a history of racial discrimination or states with, who have engaged in bad actions have to get federal approval before changing their voting systems. But we need more than that too, because it's not enough to just go back to the Voting Rights Act. We have to have national federal legislation that guarantees same-day registration, automatic voter registration, restoring voting rights to those who have been convicted of felonies, to finally end that stain on our nation rooted in Jim Crow. We need to have regulations of voter purges. We need to do everything we can on the federal level to ensure the right to vote is exactly that, a right.
Yeah.
That we try and maximize political participation instead of trying to restrict it. And that can only really be done. It can be done in states across the country, but it's time to now really think about federal legislation.
I agree. Let's talk about another potential solution. You've written quite a bit about Andrew Yang's democracy dollars idea. What do you think about this, about his plan in terms of taking on some of the challenges facing our democracy?
I mean, I think the voucher idea is fantastic. And the article that you're referring to was something I wrote in The Hill, which was born out of a little bit of anger because he proposed in not this past debate, in the debate beforehand, democracy voucher policy, which, as I said, every voter would get in his plan $100 worth of democracy vouchers to give to a candidate of their choice. That's a very amazing piece of public financing legislation. And the media circuit, they were just panning it. They were making a joke. They were saying, oh, I would spend this money at Olive Garden. I mean, that's a joke. That's not a serious policy discussion. This is a serious proposal that currently is in practice. It has been implemented in Seattle.
Yeah.
And it's working amazingly well thus far. It's still early. This is the second cycle. But you see candidates going to low-income housing, to the homeless, to try and solicit donations. What a radical transformation of campaigning when you have to go to people who have never been sought after, who previously have never had a political voice.
Yeah.
And this is why it's so exciting that candidates like Bernie Sanders and a couple others, Kirsten Gillibrand had a proposal when she was still in the race to implement public financing vouchers. And we're at this moment now where public financing, the vast majority of candidates, or maybe not a majority because there's so many, but a good chunk, almost about a dozen, are supporting public financing of elections. We've come such a long way to getting this idea to be salient on the national debate stage. And the fact that we're even there is a sign of progress. But now we need to actually begin to have a conversation about the differences in policies. What are the candidates proposing, and what therefore should voters choose?
So one last quick question, because I know that you sort of alluded to this, but you referred to the just casual dismissal or complete lack of attention to proposals like the democracy dollars idea as journalistic malpractice. Why do you think that, especially considering that they need to fill a lot of digital space with text and they have to talk 24-hour cable news shows, that you would think that new ideas would be like, hey, something new to talk about, but instead they ignore it. Why are they so comfortable casting aside these ideas?
I just don't think that the media, pundits think this is as big a problem as the majority of Americans do. No matter how many polls come out showing the super majority of Americans want fundamental change in the way we fund our elections, or are super concerned about the suppression of voting, or the disgust about gerrymandering, that recognition hasn't seemed to translate up to the folks who are pontificating about these races. It's a shame, but that makes the work that we're doing, the advocates on the ground, folks like you, John, trying to elevate this issue, all the more important. Because here's the thing, we know that when the American people have a chance to vote on these reforms, they overwhelmingly pass it. And so this is one reason why it's ever more important for presidential candidates to talk about it, because they can bypass the media to just keep using their bully pulpits to educate about solutions. That's the biggest hindrance right now. People feel hopeless, not apathetic. They just don't know that we can fix it. The more we present solutions, the more I think activism will be created and encouraged, because it will remind people that we know what to do to fix our broken democracy. The question is just, how do we fight for it? And, who are the politicians who are going to champion the issue moving forward?
I agree. Adam Eichen, author and campaigns manager for Equal Citizens. Hope to see you after the next debate.
And hopefully it'll be better news next time.
Hopefully, but probably not.
Thanks.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break, come back, lots more to get to. What is actually going on right now in Syria? I think that's an incredibly important question, because we have an idea, right? There's a narrative of what's happening, but the news that I'm reading does not actually confirm that. The idea is Trump decided we're gonna pull out the troops, and we pulled out the troops. Bada bing, bada boom, here's your tragedy. But it's actually worse than that, because that makes it seem as if the message was disseminated from the top down to the troops at the local level, and then they moved out. So, okay, you take that narrative and then see how that holds up against these news updates that I've seen in the last day. The US military destroyed its own anti-ISIS headquarters in Syria, the Wall Street Journal reported yesterday, to prevent them from falling into the hands of fighters backed by Turkey. Yes, we bombed and destroyed our own headquarters. That sounds bad, right? It's actually worse than that as we proceed. According to the Wall Street Journal, Turkish-backed troops advanced on the facility, which had been used to equip and train SDF fighters against ISIS on Tuesday, leading US officials to quickly withdraw US troops and destroy the base, using F-15s and Apache helicopters as a show of force to warn them away while US troops were still there. But the air power failed to dissuade the Turkish-backed forces. SDF fighters fled and set fire to their part of the base, and US troops left before US assets destroyed the base. That paragraph is madness, and it's barely getting talked about. So us destroying our own bases is one thing, hypothetically. If we're pulling out, okay, we're not gonna be there. We don't know what's gonna happen with it. Turkey might take it over. Okay, it's really weird that Turkey, who up till recently was our ally, that we're so worried about them taking over these bases that we would bomb them. But how we did it, what is this? They're advancing. Apparently, we don't think that we can stop them. So we take planes and helicopters as a show of force against this group that is supposedly our allies to dissuade them from what exactly? From attacking the base? And then the planes and helicopters failed to dissuade them. That show of force was not sufficient to stop them from doing what exactly? I think that's a necessary follow-up question. So if they had not fled, not retreated, if they had not fled from that base and blown it up, what would have happened exactly? And I think we have some idea based on what happened last week. Another piece of news that people just quickly passed over. Last Friday, Turkish forces fired at an American position in Syria. While no casualties were sustained, it came after reassurances from Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, that Turkey knew where US troops were stationed. And it turned out they did know where the US troops were sanctioned, because the military put out a statement days later that said that they were bracketing our troops to scare them away. If they know that our forces are here, they mortared here and here to drive our soldiers out. Again, this is our ally. They're trying to scare us out of the area. And again, not just scare. It's one thing to bracket our troops. That's horrific. Easily could have killed some of them. But I really would have loved to have known what would have happened at that facility, at those headquarters, if we had not fled while bombing it to stop it from falling into, I think it's safe to say, enemy hands at this point. But again, this is a story that is just, we're moving past it as a society. Turkey, who's been our allies for a long time, apparently was threatening to kill our soldiers and take over our territory. We're not at war with them. I don't want to be at war with them, but it sure seems like they were looking to be at war with us. That's bizarre, I think. And anyway, if you want peace, as I do, but a peace that does not involve the peace being bought on the backs of thousands of dead, both fighters and civilians on the side of the Kurds, you actually, it turns out, could have had that. As I've been saying the entire thing, the idea that this false dichotomy between letting the entire place turn into literal hell on earth versus just forever having a military presence there, that is a fundamentally false dichotomy that is being dispatched to fool you. Turns out the middle ground that I've been talking about was being worked on. In the weeks leading up to Trump's decision to exit Syria, his NSC staff had been preparing and presenting a variety of plans for an orderly withdrawal. The goal was to avoid a violent rush to fill a power vacuum opened by a sudden US exit. That violent rush to fill a power vacuum is what we're seeing as Iran and Syria and Russia and Turkey are all moving into that area, some on the side of the Kurds, some against the Kurds, but the body count is racking up. And look, the NSC, hardly generally historically a force for peace in the world, but here, that is what they were working on. They were working on getting our troops out of the region, which is what we want, while not resulting in massive human rights abuses against the Kurds. That should be what we're going for. That is what was being worked on, but Trump either did not desire that, which implies that he's actually happy with what's going on right now, or was simply so impetuous and lacking in patience that he wouldn't give it the weeks that it would take to deploy a plan that would generate actual peace, not this horrific situation that we found ourselves in. I feel like there is some focus on this, and honestly, like even Lindsey Graham occasionally is critical of Donald Trump, although he vacillates on that on a daily basis. But there are some more fundamental questions about what exactly is going on there and what led to the situation we're in that have not been answered and honestly have not even really been presented as questions. But I want reporters, I want people who can look into the real estate business deals in Turkey that have the communications that led up to this. I want answers to what's going on there. I wanna know what would have happened if we had not fled. And I wanna know currently, those soldiers who were in the process of retreating, where are they right now? Are they being threatened right now? Those seem like important questions to ask. Okay, we're gonna take a short break. We come back, ranked choice voting. We're gonna break it down after this. As we get towards another election, more and more talk about potential reforms to our democracy. We've seen a lot of plans. One that has not cropped up in a lot of presidential plans, but that certainly deserves your attention is ranked choice voting, which we've talked about multiple times on the show. We're gonna go more in depth today, talk about what ranked choice voting is, what it could potentially do for our democracy, and who is working to promote it right now. And to help us with that, we're joined by Emily Risch, Acting Communications Director for Fair Vote. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So for those who may not know, and I think unfortunately a lot of Americans don't have a good idea of what ranked choice voting actually is, what is it?
Yeah, so ranked choice voting allows you to rank your candidates in order of choice, just like the name. So first, second, third choice, and so on. All first choices are counted. If a candidate receives over 50% of the vote, they win, just like any other election. If no one gets over 50% of the vote, the candidate with the least amount is eliminated, and then the voters who chose that candidate will have their second choices counted. And that continues until a candidate receives over 50% of the vote.
And so we have our current system, which is not ranked choice voting. What is it that ranked choice voting adds to that system that could make it appealing to people?
Yeah, so it allows more candidates to compete. We're seeing with the 2020 presidential election cycle that people are saying, oh, there's a lot of candidates tossing their hats into the race. Votes become divided among like-minded candidates. It really allows candidates to choose, their top 3 or 4. There's a lot of other great things about it. It provides a candidate with over a majority of support. So a candidate that appeals to a broad base of supporters. It also, civil campaigning is a big thing that people are talking about with ranked choice voting. Right now, our elections are very, very negative, and it really encourages candidates to reach beyond their base, asking voters to be their second and third choices. So it really helps candidates to stick on topic of, talking about the issues and finding ways that they can align with other candidates on those issues.
And so you gave the example of the Democratic primary where we could certainly see the implications of how ranked choice voting would affect how that's going right now. But even outside of just one party, we have, generally it's considered a 2-party system in the US. Ranked choice voting would make it easier for third parties to, have a major impact on what's going on, right?
Correct, yeah. So voters could vote for an independent as their first, maybe one of the major parties as their second and third choice, and so on. It allows you to not vote for the lesser of 2 evils. That's the conversation that people have talked a lot about. Is that in our current election cycle, you have to I have to choose between the Democrats or the Republicans. It really allows for third parties, independents, and other candidates to come into the race and be a part of the conversation and the elections. Right now, we're seeing a lot of discouragement of that. There's talk of spoilers, and ranked choice voting really solves that issue of wasted votes and spoilers.
There was one other benefit that you on your website is discussed, and that is there was apparently a 2016 study that showed that ranked choice voting would increase the chance that a woman will win local elective office, and also increase the proportion of female candidates of color running and winning local elective office. Do we have any idea why exactly that is?
It encourages more women and more people of color to run and win. I think it's the civil campaigning in a lot of senses why people want to, why ranked choice voting is doing so well there. It's hard to say, but we'll see as more and more cities use this. It's used in the Bay Area and a number of cities there, Minneapolis and St. Paul. We're seeing more women and more people of color elected in those cities, as well as Santa Fe, New Mexico already used it. Las Cruces will use it for the first time. Maine, obviously the state of Maine has used it. And so, a number of cities, and we're seeing more women are running and more people of color are running and getting elected in those cities.
And sort of related to ranked choice voting, ranked choice polling, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we have a YouGov poll that we recently released in early September ahead of that debate, and it showed that that voters who took the poll ranked up to 5 choices. About 85% of them ranked up to 5 choices. So people, that told us that people like to rank their choices, fully express themselves. And so actually in our poll, Warren came out on top on the final round. Biden, up until the final round, was ahead, and then Bernie supporters ended up supporting Warren, and so it just kind of shows that Warren has appealed to the base of at least the 1,000 people that we polled. But it's really exciting these times, and the presidential elections. With all the candidates who have tossed their hats in the race, have just it's allowed people to bring different platforms, to the national conversation. And so I think that's a good thing. I think competition is good. I think that it's better for democracy. Ranked choice voting really allows for that.
Well, very interesting. Thank you for providing that information. I think we are going to hear more about it in the near future. And we really appreciate your work, Emily.
Thank you so much.
We're going to take a short break here. We come back, news from around the world. And meanwhile, in. And now news from around the world. And meanwhile, in. Meanwhile, in Hong Kong, the authoritarian crackdown on the absolutely massive pro-democracy protests that we've seen, literally numbering in the millions and sustained for longer than I think I've ever seen a protest sustained for, they've come from the authoritarians in both ridiculous and horrendous forms. So first, the ridiculous. The South China Morning Post reports that customs officials in mainland China have ordered courier firms not to send black clothes and many other items used by protesters across the border. One firm says that the list of items it's banned from delivering to Hong Kong includes yellow helmets, yellow umbrellas, flags, flag poles, poster banners, gloves, masks, black t-shirts, metal rods, fluorescent tubes, and bludgeon clubs, which are apparently a product that you can buy. But anyway, this sort of petty attempt to make it slightly more difficult for the protesters to coordinate their outfits seems a little bit short-sighted, and many protesters reached for comment on this, said, we can wear other colors, which I think they can easily do. Harder to bounce back from, though, is the violence against these protesters, and that reached really dangerous levels. There have been people who've been, there's been deadly violence already, but one of the leaders was attacked recently. This is Jimmy Sham, who leads the Civil Human Rights Front and has been actively involved in the months-long anti-government protest movement, was left bloodied and dazed after an attack Wednesday evening. He was apparently attacked by a group of 5 or 6 individuals wielding hammers. They beat him with hammers, and when bystanders tried to intervene, they were threatened themselves, again, to be beaten potentially to death with hammers. And this individual, who again, had just been recently attacked in just about as horrendous a fashion as I can possibly imagine. His colleague says, when Jimmy Sham was taken out of the ambulance, he told me 5 demands, not 1 less. Like he could potentially die. And he's saying, we don't back down 1 bit. And for those of you who might not have been following this, the 5 demands are the complete withdrawal of the extradition bill, establishment of an independent commission of inquiry into police conduct, retraction of the designation of riot to describe the protests, amnesty for arrested protesters, and full democracy. And many people have already been arrested. And so, I mean, you can't help but look on this movement and just think this is what we should be seeing. These are people who are sustaining this movement under unimaginable circumstances for longer than I could have possibly imagined, even at risk to their own lives and not backing down. And that is, look, it's obviously very dark, but in another way, it's also incredibly heartwarming. Meanwhile, in the oceans, environmental regulations have apparently accomplished their goals when it comes to rejuvenating a species that had been down to virtual extinction. One of the whale populations taken to the edge of extinction by commercial hunting in the early 20th century has essentially recovered its numbers. This is humpback whales. This group was reduced to only a few hundred. The entire species, a few hundred, because of steam-driven boats and harpoons operated the British overseas territory of South Georgia. It was so bad at one point that even though this same industry was still trying to exploit the whales, they found it almost impossible to do so because there were so few they couldn't even find them. And so it got down to hunting of about a dozen or so a year, not for want of trying. And so international regulations to try to protect this species were put into effect, and it's reckoned there are now just short of 25,000 individuals in the Southwest Atlantic, more than 90% of the pre-exploitation level, which is amazing. I mean, they were this close to dying out entirely. We're done with that species, and international governments took it seriously, put protections in place, and even though there are still some trying to do this sort of whaling, and there's still a lot of whaling going on for other species, it has been almost entirely successful. This is a reminder that when governments actually agree to do what's necessary to protect the environment and those that live in it, it can be successful. Meanwhile, the UK has been the site of near constant protests by Extinction Rebellion and other pro-environmental, anti-climate change activist groups for some time. The UK government recently decided that's enough of that, and they decided to ban the protests from the entirety of London, which is apparently a thing they can do, or at least they can try to do. On Monday, Scotland Yard issued a Section 14 order banning the group, this is Extinction Rebellion, from demonstrating anywhere in the capital. A judicial review of the ban, which the group's lawyers say is disproportionate and unlawful, will be held this afternoon, actually. The order has been condemned by the Green Party and the Labour Party, with Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott describing it as completely contrary to Britain's long-held traditions of policing by consent, freedom of speech, and the right to protest. Now, of course, we have to acknowledge that Britain does not have the same sort of constitution nor Bill of Rights that we have here in the United States, but that does not mean that they don't have a history of at least general protections of freedom of speech and the ability to assemble and to protest. And apparently, that long history has run up against inconvenience over streets being blocked. And yes, I understand that if your commute is delayed, slowed down by these protests, that's going to be inconvenient. I would argue though that the full effects of a greater than 2 degrees Celsius rise in global average temperatures is going to end up being, in a variety of ways, more inconvenient for you, and not just when it comes to your commute. And it is difficult for regular people to see beyond the day-to-day difficulties that they face. They are very real, I understand that. But thankfully there are people who are looking ahead to the future, and Extinction Rebellion is a great example of that. One other great example of that is Greta Thunberg, who talked about these bans and said this: if standing up against the climate and ecological breakdown and for humanity is against the rules, then the rules must be broken. And she's 100% right. I have no doubt that if people do continue to protest, and by the way, they are right now. They have decided not to abide by this ban. They are still protesting. They could be locked up. They could face serious consequences. But the world is facing more serious consequences. And thankfully, we have people operating here in the United States, in the UK, and around the world who are finally taking it seriously. And they're not gonna let some ban on protests stop them from doing that. And so thank you to Greta, thank you to Extinction Rebellion for doing that. The stakes could not be any higher. Okay, that's all the time we have, unfortunately, for the show. Again, not time to read some of these reviews that I really wish I could read, because you guys have been doing a great job of rating and reviewing the podcast on iTunes. I always appreciate that. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Tomorrow is gonna be Brett and Brooke taking over for me. They'll see you then. Thanks for listening to the full episode of The Damage Report. Support our work, listen ad-free, access members-only bonus content, and more by subscribing to Apple Podcasts at apple.co/TYT. I'm your host, John Adarola. I'll see you soon.